Good day, everyone, and welcome to Cochrane Canada Live. That is the research webinar series brought to you by the Canadian Cochrane Centre. My name is Adrienne Stevens. I hope you're having a great day, and welcome to the last series for the calendar year. And I have December 8th, 9th, as I broadcast here from Ottawa, Canada, where it was snowy, and on December 8th. And our speaker is joining us from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and it's December 9th. So welcome to all of you. And so before we get started, I just want to thank the funders of Cochrane Canada, those being the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, in particular the Knowledge Synthesis and Exchange Branch, and to the 7 research institutes who support Cochrane Canada. Thank you very much for your support during this funding period. And I'd like to make special mention of the Pan American Health Organization. That is the regional office of the WHO for the Americas, to the Research Promotion and Development Division for providing Illuminate Live to the Canadian Cochrane Centre to produce the webinars such as the one for today. Thank you, PAHO, a valued partner. And I just want to make mention to you folks, in March of this year, the New Zealand branch of the Australasian Cochrane Centre hosted a symposium in Auckland in association with the New Zealand Guidelines Group, and they've made the recordings available online. And so if you simply go to cochrane.org and click on the multimedia portal, and then on the left-hand side you'll see the Evidence on Trial Symposium. That's how you can access the recordings. And in fact, one of the speakers from that symposium is today's featured speaker, and so we look forward to hearing from him. And so I just want to remind you before we get started, a few of the features within Illuminate Live. When it comes time to ask questions, and today's speaker will prompt you when he'd like to receive questions, and you can send them through the chat room, or if you join us with the microphone, all you simply need to do is click this button right here, and a queue will form in the participant window, and then we will take your questions in order. As well, during the session, if you wish to communicate with the speaker, send through a happy face, applause. Please feel free to do so, and that will assist him in as he's conducting his seminar. And just to remind you of the format of today's webinar, and so we have it as one person's audio activated at a time. When you're ready to ask your question, when it's time to receive questions, as I mentioned earlier, you just simply have to raise your hand, and we will instruct you as to when we'll receive your questions. So all you need to do is click on your audio button here, which you see at the bottom left-hand portion of your screen. Ask your question, and don't forget to press the button again. That releases your audio, and it will allow today's speaker to come on to answer your question. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Rod Jackson. Rod's a professor of epidemiology at the School of Population Health in the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences at the University of Auckland. He is also the director of EPIQ, an in-house group undertaking teaching, research, and consultancies in evidence-based practice, health informatics, and quality improvement for healthcare services. He is medically trained, has a PhD in epidemiology, and is a member of the New Zealand College of Public Health Medicine. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed papers. His main research interest for the last 25 years has been with the epidemiology of chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular diseases. And he is involved with guideline and web-based initiatives relating to managing cardiovascular disease risk in New Zealand. But today we will hear from him as he speaks from his work that he's been doing over the past decade in developing a graphic tool for teaching critical appraisal and study design of epidemiological studies, that being the GATE, or Graphic Appraisal Tool for Epidemiology, which is now being used internationally. And so I will ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Rod Jackson.
Well, thank you very much for the applause. This is my first time on a webinar, so I have to make sure I get the technology right. I'm coming to you from Auckland. It's 10 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of December here, and it's a beautiful day, so a little bit different from Canada. Okay, so I'm going to get straight into this. What I'm hoping to do over the next hour is to introduce you to a rapid critical appraisal approach, and it's using GATE. Now, as Adrienne mentioned, GATE stands for Graphic Appraisal Tool for Epidemiology. And I'm going to take you through one picture, two formulas, and three acronyms. And armed with these tools, the GATE tools, you should be able to rapidly, critically appraise most clinical papers, and I'll take you through that. I've actually been working on this for about 20 years. It started back in the early 1990s when I had to teach medical students epidemiology. And over the last 20 years, I've tweaked and modified and developed this approach to keep medical students awake. And I discovered over time that this was a good approach for both teaching critical appraisal and indeed epidemiological study design. So let's get underway. Now, the outline of the webinar, I'm going to describe the GATE approach. I'm going to illustrate it by applying the Lancet paper that we circulated. I'm going to assume you've read this, although it's not essential that you've read it. And you could also, if you'd like to, fill in the GATE light form that we also circulated as we go. When I come to the paper, you have an opportunity to fill it in. I'll take one or two questions if the time is going okay, and we'll just have to play it by ear. I'm just not sure how long this is going to take me to get through, but let's go. So here is the GATE picture. So I said we'd start with one picture, and this frame, a triangle, a circle, a square, and these arrows represent the shape of every epidemiological study, which I'll demonstrate to you. In fact, this is my whole career in one picture. I've attempted to simplify epidemiology. This is actually the epidemiological paradigm. And just to illustrate this, so here's a standard longitudinal cohort study. I've just taken the example of British doctors, which is the population studied. The British doctor study looked at smoking status, so British doctors were differentiated into smokers and non-smokers in the circle. They were followed up initially over a period of 10 years, and the main outcome initially was lung cancer. And this is where the lung cancer numbers go. So that was a typical longitudinal study. The same shape of the same GATE shape actually describes a cross-sectional study. It looks identical. I've used British doctors again. I've used smoking status again. But if you were interested in the relationship between smoking and lung function, then you could measure smoking status and lung function at the same time. So this arrow now represents a cross-sectional study where the outcome of interest is measured cross-sectionally rather than longitudinally. And here's a randomized controlled trial. It looks the same. I've used British doctors again, but this time randomized to aspirin or placebo, followed up over a period of time, with the outcome being myocardial infarction. And it goes on. Diagnostic test accuracy studies. Now, this is a slightly different approach in that the population of interest for screening is still in the triangle, which in this case I've taken middle-aged US women, but the circle includes those who have breast cancer and those who don't have breast cancer. And the outcome is, in this case, the test will not have to be positive or negative. So I'm not going to be talking about diagnostic test accuracy studies today, but you can look on our website to get a little bit more information on this, and it's possible. Probably, if there's interest, I'll probably do another webinar specifically on diagnostic test accuracy studies. This design is about how you critically appraise a diagnostic test accuracy study. Clinicians use diagnostic tests in a slightly different way. A clinician will take a patient, apply a test, and the patient will either be positive or negative, and the clinician is then interested in, given a positive test, what's the probability that this person has breast cancer, or if they've got a negative test, what's the probability that they have breast cancer. Now, that's the clinical use of a diagnostic test as opposed to the critical appraisal. But again, this is going to be the topic of another webinar. So there's the picture. This picture, the gate frame, actually describes every epidemiological study, and so you can hang any epidemiological study on the gate frame. And today we're going to hang the randomized controlled trial on the gate frame. Now, the first acronym, I said there was one picture, 2 equations, and 3 acronyms. Well, here's the first acronym, and the first acronym is PECOT. And PECOT is just a more complete version of the PICO acronym that many of you will know about. P is the same, P is for participants. The E is for the exposure group, as opposed to with PICO, the intervention group. I've designed GATE and PECOT to be more generic than the original PICO. PICO was primarily for intervention studies, whereas PECOT covers intervention studies, but also covers other types of studies. So E for exposure group, C for comparison group, the same with the C in PICO. And then the last letter T is missing from PICO. But for any of you who are epidemiologists, professional epidemiologists, you know that timing is everything. And indeed it's important in critical appraising a study. So PECOT really gives a more complete description of the components of the triangle, circle, square, and arrow. So it's really describing the components of a study. So once you understand you know what the picture is, the GATE picture, and PECOT, you can undertake the first task of critical appraisal, which is to describe a study's design by hanging it on the gate frame and labeling it using the PECOT acronym. Now, you'll notice that I've added 2 other parts to the triangle. The triangle, circle, square that I showed you before was cut off here. But when we start a critical appraisal, we're certainly interested in the participants, but we want to know where they come from. We want to know the setting they came from. We want to know who is eligible, and then ultimately we want to know who takes part. So I've added the 2 upper parts to the triangle as a memory jogger when looking at the participants in a study. So when we apply the study that we've been looking at, the study that you would have been sent, you've been sent it's the study by John Sclerodal, Frequency and Prevention of Symptomless DVT in long-haul flights. If you start putting the study onto the gate frame, this is how your first page will look, or the top. This is how the triangle on the gate frame. So when we hang the study on the gate frame, and for those of you who have downloaded the gate form, the gate light form, you'll notice it's got 3 pages. The front page is the form that we recommend that the first time you start using the gateway, you use this page. On the back of the first page is the glossary, and then we've also put at the very back a gate very light. And this form, I've taken out many of the questions, the sub-questions, and it just gives you more space to fill it in. But we find that using a form like this, you can rapidly appraise most studies. There's another one of these for diagnostic test studies, which I've just put on our website. But this form is designed to use with randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, and cross-sectional studies. So in the study, the setting was London in the UK, and even though they don't give you the time of when they did the study, one can assume it's in the late 90s because the study was published in 2001. It probably took them a year or two to get all of the analysis done. So I'm assuming the study was done in sometime in the 90s. The eligible participants, people with no previous DVT, they had to be older than 50 years, and they all had to have planned economy air travel of at least 2 sectors greater than 8 hours. Now, there are a number of other factors among the eligibility criteria, and I've just put down the main ones. And then there were 231 participants, and I've just put down here the mean age was 61 to 62 years. Now, the point of filling in the gate frame is many of us read a paper and we're halfway through, and then we're trying to remember, gosh, who were these people? I just can't remember who they were. If you fill in the gate frame as you go through a paper, it makes it much more efficient because you find you're not always going back to look for things that you've kind of forgotten about. And most of the time, if I don't have the gate-like form with me, I draw little triangles, circles, and squares all over the paper that I'm reading. And from our experience, you can critically appraise papers in about a half to a third of the time it would take you if you were writing things down as you go. So it does make it a more efficient process. So moving on, so we've covered the triangle. Now the circle is simply the exposure group. So among those people who were in the study, the participants, they are typically allocated to an exposure group, which are called here EG, and a comparison group, or CG. And if we look at the study, so there were 231 participants, and they were randomized to either below-knee compression stockings, it was 115, and the comparison was no stockings, and there were 116 in that group. And if you wanted, you can fill those numbers in on the gate-like form as we go through. And this is what I do. If I put the numbers in as I go through, I find it helps in understanding how the study was done. So moving on, as you read through the paper, you'll find that even though they randomized 115 and 116, the number of participants who completed follow-up was 100 in each group. So I tend to put the number who completed follow-up in the circle, rather than, and the number who were randomized were initially allocated just above the circle. Then you move to the square, which is the outcomes. And many of you will recognize that the square is simply the 2x2 table of traditional epidemiology. I certainly find when teaching epidemiology, if you teach the 2x2 table, many students glaze over because it's not something that they're used to. But if you've actually given them the context, starting with the participants in the triangle, the exposure and comparison groups in the circle, and then come to the 2x2 table, I find students tend to pick it up and get it much more quickly. So it's a very good way of giving a context to the 2x2 table of epidemiology. And so in this study, the main outcome was DVT, and in the group allocated to compression stockings, among this 100, actually none of them had a DVT, but in the group allocated to no compression stockings, 12 had a DVT. This is a follow-up. So again, you can potentially fill in these numbers. They often don't give these numbers, but one can assume that if there are 100 in the study, none had a DVT, so therefore 100 didn't have a DVT, whereas here 12 had a DVT, so 98 didn't have a DVT. So you can fill these numbers in if you so choose. Now to time. This is what the two arrows. Now you'll see there's two arrows. There's a down arrow, vertical arrow, which is used to signal incidence if the study measures incidence, whereas a horizontal arrow describes a prevalence outcome. And just as an aside, although we're talking critical appraisal today, this is a good way of teaching the difference, a simple way of teaching the difference between incidence and prevalence, which students find they have a lot of trouble with. So in this study, if you were looking at death, so among people randomized to compression stockings or no compression stockings, you could measure the incidence of death from time of takeoff to the 48 hours post the final flight, which is when the study investigators saw the participants again. Now, the good news was there were no deaths, one of their measures was to look at the incidence of death. They hoped there weren't any, and there weren't. But the main outcome in this study was the number of DVTs, which was measured at a post-flight assessment. So within 48 hours of the final flight, all the participants went back to the study centre and had various measures to assess whether they'd had a DVT. And in fact, there were no DVTs, as I mentioned before, no DVTs in the group allocated to stockings, and 12 in the other group. Now, this is a prevalence measure, or for those of you who are into epidemiological measurements, it could also be a cumulative incidence measure. But that's not so relevant in this study. But everyone was assessed within 48 hours of returning from their last flight. So basically, using the picture and the first acronym, you can hang your study on the gate frame. And that's the first step of critical appraisal. And so here we have what your gate frame might look a little bit like, with the setting, the eligibility criteria, the participants, exposure comparison, the outcome, which is DVT, and the time. You probably should put at 48 hours post-flight. And so there's a summary, basic summary of what happened in the study. So that's the first stage of critical appraisal. So I just want to check, are there any questions at this time, or is this reasonably straightforward? Adrienne, I'll let you take over if there are any questions.
Okay, so if you have questions to ask, you can either put them right into the chat room, and I see that someone has their chat room activated, so please go ahead and insert your question, or you can use your microphone. And so to remind you again, just under the participant window, if you want to select your the hand button, and that will allow a queue to form, and we can take your questions in order. So Kuka, I'll just wait a minute. It looks as though there's something coming through, and when you send your question through, I'll actually repeat it for everyone to hear, and then ask Rod to answer it. So once again, you can use the chat room to put your questions through, or you can use your microphone. So Cook, it seems to be taking a minute for it to come through. So I'll just wait one more second. Just make sure there's no delays that are happening on Illuminate. Great. So the question is, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much. I think this is a great tool compared to other checklists available out there. I was wondering how you then put this all together with regard to assessing the quality of the paper. And so now I'll hand the microphone over to Rod.
Well, what you've done is you've just identified the next step in this presentation. So I'm now going to move on. In fact, the next part is actually looking at the analysis, and then I move on to the quality assessment as the next stage. So let's carry on. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce you to the first formula. So you've had one picture and had one acronym, and here's the first formula, and the formula is that occurrence or risk of disease equals numerator divided by denominator divided by time. Now, this is the standard formula of all epidemiological studies, as all epidemiological studies involve measuring the occurrence of outcomes. Not always disease, but more often than not. And in an epidemiological study, the denominator, the participants, and the numerator are the outcomes. So occurrence, the simplest form of occurrence, is numerator divided by denominator. And I use the egg timer as an analogy, in that the participants, everybody starts off in the top, and then over time, as the sand moves down, that's the equivalent of events happening. So these are the numerator, the events, the outcomes. But the reason I use the egg timer is that all of these events must originate from this denominator. So occurrence in epidemiology equals numerator divided by denominator. Actually, it's there's one more part to it. It's numerator divided by denominator, and then it's per unit time, which is this is, I often say, this is the E equals MC squared of epidemiology, and that's the occurrence equals N divided by D divided by T. Okay, so that's the formula, and here it is with the gate frame. So although the triangle is the original denominator, the starting point, in almost every study we subdivide the participants into two denominators. One is the exposed denominator, the people who are in the exposed group, which could be the intervention, the compression stockings, and this is the comparison group. And the outcomes, these are the number of DVTs in those with the compression stockings, and this will be the number of DVTs in those without. Okay, so and you measure these either over time or in cross-section. So let's look at the study. So there's just the same picture again as the previous page. So this is the second appraisal task. So the first task was to hang the study on the gate frame with PECOT, and the second task is to describe the analysis by hanging the numbers on the gate frame, which we've done some of those, we've hung those numbers, but then calculating the occurrences in both the exposure and comparison groups. So I've shown you this on the previous slide. EG is the denominator 1, CG denominator 2, and A and B are the numerator 1 and 2. And so what we do in epidemiology, our main task is to calculate this exposure group occurrence and the comparison group occurrence. So exposure group occurrence I call EGO, which in the simple form is simply A, the number of people with an outcome, divided by EG, which is the number of people who were allocated to the exposure group. And again, CGO, V over CG, which is simply the number of outcomes among those people who were allocated to the comparison group. I'll have to come back to this other question a little bit later because I'll just take us through this. Okay, and I've just highlighted EGO and CGO just to remind you, something we often forget is that this is the underlying task and underlying goal of every epidemiological study, whether it's a randomized trial, a cohort study, a diagnostic test. All studies are designed to do one thing, to calculate EGO and CGO. That's the purpose of the gates. That is the purpose of epidemiology and epidemiological studies, to really calculate the risk or occurrence of events in an exposed group and a comparison group. And so with this particular study, as we discussed before, EG, I've put here 100. I could have used the number of people allocated as opposed, which was I think 115, 116, but I've chosen to use for this the people who completed follow-up. So EG is 100, CG is 100, and for the purpose of this discussion, I've actually said that there were 3 events in the compression group because I want to do a calculation. There were actually 0, but I'm going to use 3, which means if there were 3 events, that means that EGO is 3 per 100. So among those people wearing compression stockings, there were 3 events per 100 people. In those who were in the comparison group, again 100 people, there were 12 events. So CGO is 12 over 100. So basically 3% of people who wore compression stockings, for my example, had a DVT, and 12% of people with without compression stockings had a DVT. Okay, so with those numbers, you can then calculate the main types of calculation that we use in epidemiology. We use relative differences or relative risks, which is simply EGO divided by CGO. We calculate absolute differences or risk differences, which is simply EGO minus CGO. And the final calculation we typically do is the number needed to treat or number needed to expose, which is 1 over RD, so which is 1 over EGO minus CGO. So in this study, there are the numbers. So the relative risk, 3 over 100 divided by 12 over 100 equals 3 over 12, 0.25. So that's the relative risk, EGO over CGO. The risk difference, 3 per 100 divided by 12 per 100 equals minus 9 per 100. So the difference between the 2 groups was 7.5 DBTs per 100. And the number needed to treat, for those of you who use the number needed to treat, it's simply the reciprocal of the risk difference, which is rather than 7.5 over 100, it's 100 divided by 7.5, which is 13.3. So using my example, that means for every 13.3 people who wear compression stockings, there'll be 1 fewer DVT. Okay? So that's really the analysis that we do in epidemiological studies. We calculate EGO and CGO, and then having calculated it, we then simply determine the relative risk, EGO divided by CGO, or the risk difference, ego minus ego, or the number needed to treat 1 over the risk difference. And that's the basic. Of course, the devil is always in the detail, but that's the basic epidemiological calculation. Now, I'm just going to check the hand. I see there's a note first. Let me just do this, and then I'll come back to the hand raised. So Annie is saying, I noticed that the gate right is much more complicated than what you described, particularly the study analysis section at the bottom. Where on the frame does this lie, or is it an add-on? Okay. You have to tell me whether I've now answered your question. So, Adrienne, what happens? Do I click on the hand? Sorry. Adrienne, there's a hand raised. Oh, I see. Is that the question? Okay. The question is, how is the absolute difference 7.5? Okay. Simply that, sorry about that. So, oh, you're right. Actually, sorry, there's a mistake here. You're right, you're absolutely right. There's a mistake. Sorry, that should be 9 per 100. Okay, I apologise for that. This is meant to be, so if there's 3 per 100 in one group and 9 per 100 in the other group, then this should be, okay. What I've done is, when I was doing this, I was swapping. I did some cutting and pasting. I apologise. That is minus 9 per 100, and that should be minus 9 per 100. So I'd need to do that calculation again. I will certainly fix this up after the presentation. My apologies. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Minus 9 over 12 does equal 7.5, but actually the absolute difference should be 3 per 100 minus 12 per 100 equals minus 9 per 100. That's what it should be. So I need to change this line and change this line. Okay, my apologies. We'll fix that up before we make the presentation, at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's move on. So study analysis is basically, it's all about ego and CGO. Okay, and from experience I find that this is a very easy way to teach the basics of the analyses that are required in randomized trials and cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, and indeed in diagnostic test accuracy studies, although the names of some of these measurements are slightly different in diagnostic test accuracy studies. Any other questions at this stage?
Rosman, I see that you might be entering a question, so how about we just wait a minute? And Rosman, if you're able to send your question through. Otherwise, if it's just another minute or two, then maybe we can ask Rod to move on. Okay, so Rod, why don't you, oh, the question's there. Sorry, I do see it now. What about the odds ratio? Is this the RD? So I'll just hand the microphone back over to Rod. Hi, sorry to interrupt you, Rod. I don't see your microphone activated, so I just wondered if maybe if you had pressed the button and for some reason it didn't come through. So I'll release my audio and then you can activate yours again. Thank you.
I apologize, I didn't activate it. So just to answer that question, an odds ratio is a bit like a relative risk, not the risk difference. So a relative risk is EGO over CGO, which is A over EG divided by B over CG. That's the relative risk. An odds ratio is A over C divided by B over D. So odds ratios are originally used primarily in case control studies where you didn't know everybody in EG and CG. All you had were cases and controls. And so odds ratios are usually quite similar to a relative risk. But again, probably I'd have to cover that in another session. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll move on. Okay, so we got up to that point. Now I want to move on to the question that I was asked earlier by Ani about was it Ani or was it no, by Kuku about analysis about quality. So I now want to introduce you to the second acronym, RAMBO, and it's a memorable acronym with many of you will know RAMBO. And this RAMBO originally came from Paul Glasio. Many of you know Paul Glasio, who was the director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford and is now back in Australia. But RAMBO, and I'll just move to the next slide, RAMBO identifies the key types of biases or systematic errors that can occur in epidemiological studies. And the first type of error relates to recruitment. How did we recruit people for the study? The second type of error is around allocation. How did people get allocated to the exposure and comparison group? The third error, maintenance, and I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. The third error is once people were allocated, did they stay in the groups they were allocated to? And the final error relates to the assessment of outcomes, and we use B and O because we're talking about were the assessments of outcomes measured blindly or objectively. So I'm going to go through those, but you might have seen different words used when looking at the quality of studies, but RAMBO does identify the key biases that can occur in all epidemiological studies. Now, just before I go on, I'm going to check this question here. In terms of the relative risk and risk difference, I assume that the formula for EGO and CGO would become AD and BC on a 2x2 table. Okay, right. Well, yes, you're correct. There is no time in the denominator, but AD and BC, AD divided by BC is actually the same as AC divided by BD, if you just do the mathematics. So yes, in a typical case control study, you start with A is the cases are exposed, and yeah. So I won't go into that today, but you're absolutely right that AD divided by BC is correct, but it does happen to be the same as A over C divided by B over D. So I think I'll have to cover that in a different session. So coming back to the quality assessment in RAMBO, let's just go through the third task, and I think the time is getting on, so I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly. I started, the first task was to hang the study on the gate frame with the picture in the first acronym. The second task was to use the first equation to calculate EGO and CGO. And the third task is to look at and to identify where bias could have occurred in the study using RAMBO. So let's just do that. So the first question for RAMBO is, were the recruitment processes appropriate to the study goals? We originally used R as representativeness, but we've changed this to recruitment because representativeness is particularly important only in very specific studies. I think we spend too much time and are far too critical of whether studies include patients similar to our own. What you really want to know is were the recruitment processes appropriate to the study design, to the study goals, and does it really matter how participants were recruited in terms of interest? And there's a series of questions to help you look at the recruitment process, which I'm going to let you look at later. But in this study, they recruited volunteers from advertisements. So these are obviously motivated volunteers. They described the eligibility criteria reasonably well. And as far as we know, the participants were representative of the eligibles. They considered 479 people. They excluded 248 who didn't meet the criteria. And many studies don't actually tell you how many people were initially looked at, how many people were eligible, and then how many participated. But you often find that if you try to draw this gate frame, you find that this group here is a very tiny group. And I see there's a question from Rosman about, is there a score assigned for the scale? Okay, it's a great question. We've used a number of different scores over the years. We traditionally used to have a three-point scale that if you thought the study if they were recruited well, you would say it was good. If they did it badly, it was bad. And then we used to have an in-between score that it was okay. I've moved more to a okay, not okay score. So just really a dichotomous score. When you look at the data, do you think it was okay? If it was okay, you would continue to look at, continue to appraise the study. If it was not okay, you probably wouldn't go through this. So in my opinion, even though most of us are probably going to at least score a study as sort of high, medium, and low, certainly when I'm teaching this approach, I think one should probably dichotomize. One should make a decision. Is this study worthy of appraising, which means it's probably okay, or is it not worthy, in which case it's not okay. So I tend to go for a 2-point scale. So let's go through. So moving on to the A is for allocation. And the key question is, was the allocation to the exposure and comparison group successful? And there are two ways of allocating participants in an epidemiological study. You can either randomly allocate them, as in a randomized controlled trial, or you can allocate by measurement, which we do in a cohort study, or all other studies, so-called observational studies. We measure something in the population, like smoking status or blood result or whatever, and then having done this measurement, we allocate participants to the exposure group or the comparison group. So two ways of allocation, either by measurement or randomly. And the question is, was the allocation to the exposure and comparison group successful? And often the best way of checking if it was successful is whether the exposure group and comparison group was similar at baseline, and if they were different, which is typically the case in observational studies, did they adjust for these differences? But we're going to focus on randomized controlled trials today, and in this study, they were allocated randomly by investigators using sealed envelopes. There is always an opportunity when you use sealed envelopes that you can take another envelope out if the one you first opened didn't like the allocation. I guess that's possible in this study. But the main point in this particular study, the exposure groups and comparison groups were reasonably similar at baseline, except did happen to be more women in the stocking group, which is potentially a small concern, but the investigators point out that there isn't a major difference in DVTs between men and women in their 50s and 60s, so they didn't believe this was an important issue. Moving on to M, I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to do this reasonably rapidly. M is for maintenance. Were the participants maintained as allocated? So I've drawn the circle in an elongated way in this particular example, just to demonstrate that once people are allocated to the exposure and comparison groups, and if they do that well, you then need to be certain, well, you need to know just how many of the exposure group stayed in their group, how many of the comparison group stayed in that group. Not only just staying there, but did they continue to be exposed to what you had originally planned for them to be exposed to, and were the comparison group, did they remain unexposed to this intervention? So there's a series of standard questions when you're looking at maintenance. Ideally, the participants don't know which group they're in. That actually helps to improve maintenance, or at least makes it equivalent in each group. And then there's issues around compliance, contamination, co-interventions, and completeness of follow-up, the 4 C's. And again, just to keep this go through this reasonably rapidly, we know they weren't blind, the participants weren't blind. We don't know about the compliance. Actually, there's nothing in the paper that tells us whether those who were allocated to the compression bandage group and who all came back, we don't actually know how many of them wore their stockings during the flight. And we don't know how many of this other group actually chose to wear stockings. We're assuming that given that they were motivated volunteers, they were happy to follow instructions. But we don't know. And we don't really have any evidence of co-interventions. That's where there's something additional added to the group. And completeness of follow-up, well, it was pretty good. It was okay. They only lost 15%, so they started with 115, 116, and ended up with 100 in each group. So, we think there's several aspects of the maintenance we just don't know about. But overall, it's probably okay. And then finally, the outcomes. And this is, were the outcomes assessed blindly or objectively? Well, again, in this study, the outcome measurement was reasonably objective. So we've got B and O, but it probably ideally should start with the first question is, were they measured objectively, the outcomes? And in this case, they were reasonably objective. And also the technician was meant to be blind to which group the participants were in. So we probably have a reasonable outcome measurement, although one of my colleagues suggested that some of the participants may still have a stocking on because some of the participants left their stockings on until they came back to the assessment. So it's possible that the technician was aware for some of them wearing the stockings, but probably not a big deal. So if we put all of that together, what we've done is using the RAMBO acronym, we've been asking about the 4 biases that can occur in epidemiological studies. The 4 key biases I call recruitment bias, allocation bias, maintenance bias, and outcome bias. Now, many of you have done courses in epidemiology or have used other terms. This is often called selection bias, this is confounding, and these 2 are often included as measurement bias or misclassification bias. But I find that describing bias in these ways is more intuitive, and it fits nicely within the data. Almost there, so in this study, I've said it was all done okay. There are some parts of this are not perfect, but overall, I think it was a reasonable study. Now, I'm not going to take questions because I just want to finish very briefly, and then if there are those of you who want to stay on, I'm not sure, Adrienne, you have to tell me whether we can carry on a few minutes. But I want to finish by just the 2 last parts of this. The second formula is about assessing random error, and this is the second formula. Random error, or 95% confidence interval, equals 1.96 times the standard error. Now, there are some calculations of confidence interval that are not quite the same as this, but I use this simply to jog the memories of assessors that you always need to ask about random error. And so simply in this study, you can calculate, they give you these measurements in this study. EGO, using exactly what they gave us, was 0%, and the confidence interval was 0 to 3%, and CGO was 10% with a confidence interval of 4.8 to 16%. So they actually give us the confidence intervals. And even these aren't too wide, and there are clear differences between the 2 groups. So this is the fourth task of critical appraisal, is to assess the degree of random error. That's all I'm going to say about random error. And then the final appraisal task, which is often forgotten, is that it's all very well assessing one study, and this is particularly relevant, seeing this was mediated by Cochrane, is that it's one thing to assess one study, but you should never make a decision based on one study. Ideally, you should then, the final critical appraisal task is to search and appraise for systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the same topic. And I've created this final acronym, FAITH, which is a simple acronym for looking at the key components of a critical appraisal of a systematic review, which again is the topic of another webinar. But you need to find the appropriate studies, you need to appraise the selected studies, you need to make sure you only include the valid ones. You then, I've said, total up or synthesize the data appropriately, and only do a meta-analysis if heterogeneity is adequately addressed. Now that's a very rapid critical appraisal of a systematic review, but again, that's really the final acronym of any critical appraisal. And in fact, in this, there have been systematic reviews of this area, and it does look like there is an effect. And this, I've got, I think, 1 or 2 more slides I want to tell you. Is that GATE, I've gone through a critical appraisal, but GATE can also be used to frame the first 4 steps of the evidence-based practice process. And we've only looked at step 3, which is appraisal, and I've included a few slides at the back of this presentation that you can see how we use GATE also to look at the steps of evidence-based practice. We've gone through the steps of critical appraisal, but the steps of critical appraisal are only one component of the whole evidence-based practice approach. Now, you can go to the EPIC website. There is a GATE for every study design. I've talked about GATE Lite. We also have more comprehensive critical appraisals that are in Excel. We call those CATs. And so you can look at those. There's a new CAT I put up the other day on systematic reviews, So if you've been looking at that site, you can look there. And that's it. That's everything from me. I'm sorry I've got to 11 o'clock, but can I pass over to you, Adrienne, to tell me whether anyone wants to stay to talk or whether we have to stop now?
Okay, so I think we have time for just maybe a couple of questions, and one has come through. Thank you to Kuka. And it says, Dr. Jackson, would you put the same weight in assessing blinding and with objective outcome tool employed in a study? Rod, I'll ask you to come back on to answer that question.
Okay, a good question. You know, this is one of the frustrating things, or difficult things in teaching critical appraisal, is that there are no specific rules. It's very dependent on the outcome you're measuring. Sometimes, I mean, you know, if your outcome is they're either objective or they're not objective, or somewhere in between. And sometimes blinding makes a difference. What blinding tends to do, it means that if there's any bias in your measurement of the outcome, it's going to be similar in both groups. But I can't give you a clear-cut answer. It's highly dependent on the outcome you're measuring, and this is why the ideal critical appraiser is someone who both has the critical appraisal tools like GATE, but also understands the subject, being the study topic. Well, if you don't understand the study topic, it's very worthwhile working together with someone who does. Because a good critical appraisal does require both knowledge of the topic, the subject, the pathology, etc., of the topic of the appraisal, and critical appraisal skills.
Okay, so it looks as though we have another couple questions come through. So we'll just wait a moment for those, and then we'll need to close the session. So I'll just wait a moment, and as Rod mentioned, we'll fix up the slides, and we can send them to you afterwards. So yes, there's a question that says, is there a publication describing the GATE, Light, and CAT tools? Over to you, Rod.
Right, okay. There is on the website there is a paper that's been published in evidence-based medicine, but also in ACP Journal Club, and also in an EBM nursing journal in Canada. They're several years old now, that describe the GATE approach. There's a little bit of information on the website about the tools. But I'm in the process of writing a book, which I hope will be finished at the end of next year, about this process. It's been a long time coming, but I think it's due now. And a lot of people have been asking me questions like yours. So nothing in detail about the GATE frame as yet, but it's coming.
Okay, and I think we'll close things off there. Thank you to all of you for participating, and why don't we just give a round of applause to Rod for today's presentation. That was great, Rod. I actually quite like the visual, and I agree that, yeah, if you have that in your head as you're reading through a paper, then yeah, you can stepwise go through the things, and it makes it quite simple. So thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing your book. So to all of you, I want to thank you once again. And in just one moment, if you can just wait, I'm going to send through an evaluation form. If you could take the time to complete it, let us know about today's session, about the interface, and in particular topics that we could keep in mind for future webinars. That would be wonderful. And you can send those through to ccnc-iph@uottawa.ca. And at that time, please indicate if you'd like a copy of today's slides, and we will send that to you. And once again, I just want to thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, and end of new year, and all the best as we turn into 2011. Thank you very much.